One of the major highlights of this year's Melbourne Documentary Film Festival is a film called Changchun, or Eternal Spring. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of Eternal Spring, Jason Loftus. Jason, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Peter.
Now, the Falun Gong is such a misunderstood organization by the Chinese, who seem to think it's a threat, even though it's a very spiritual and religion, if you like to put it that way, or organization. So this story about the 2002 storming by some of the Falun Gong of a Chinese television broadcasting station to try and place on it positive aspects of the Falun Gong. Incredible story. How did you learn about it and were able to make a film about this?
Yeah, it is. I feel fortunate to have come across it. I remember it being just a news item. I had an interest already I was familiar with Falun Gong, and I had an interest in the human rights situation in China. So I recall the headline about this event, but it was just one of those, report that there was a TV hijacking of some kind in China, and, you can't reach any of the people involved. So you don't know, just kind of passes as like one of the things you'll read, third or fourth page in the world news section kind of thing. Right. And then move on. But I was making a Kung Fu video game a few years ago, and it featured a lot of hand-drawn comic book art. And I learned about this artist who was living in New York at the time, and he was originally from China, and his name is Daxiong. And he'd drawn Justice League comics and Star Wars comics, and he'd also drawn with Louis Cha, who's a major novelist in the Kung Fu space in China. It's very big, a lot of movies made on his books. So I thought this is perfect. He's got the cultural background. He's a very talented illustrator. He was willing to come up and work with us. We brought him up to Toronto, and he was working in our studio. And working with him, I came to realize that he came from the same hometown as my wife and filmmaking partner, Masha Loftus, which is the city of Changchun. But Masha was the daughter of a mid-level government official in China. She had no connection with any religious groups or any dissident communities, any persecuted groups. So just for her, hearing what had happened under her nose in her own city, what this group had gone through, and why they felt they had no recourse, in the face of this sort of onslaught of perpetual disinformation about their faith and their practice that was fueling this repression and persecution campaign. They felt they had no recourse except to climb the television poles with DVD players, or at the time, essentially CD-ROMs, and hack into the state television. It really hit home for her. And for me, as I mentioned, as someone who was already familiar with Falun Gong, sympathetic to the human rights situation in China, I just saw this artist who had this remarkable talent to just use his pen to create, to bring you into a place. It was such evocative, talent he had with his illustrations. I thought, if we could use the animation studio we have a small little animation group, and bring some of these drawings to life, it would be quite a remarkable story and a very unique opportunity for film, from a film perspective. I think, there's a lot of documentaries. I wouldn't say a lot. There's a number of documentaries that have used animation for reenactments and it's been used well. Flea was a real big hit last year. There's been a number of others over the years that I've enjoyed. But the opportunity to explore the illustration and the creation of the art as part of the storytelling was really exciting to me. And that's why, we have sort of a third of the film that's live action, and we see Daxiong interviewing these other witnesses, and the encounter with Mr. White, the lone surviving hijacker who we were able to come across. And you see him drawing, and you see him facing the nostalgia, the loss of his home, the pain of and the trauma that's associated with his own experience of being arrested and tortured and these kinds of things. And you see that in his drawings. And so I felt this was an opportunity to pull the curtains back a little bit. The animation is not just a decision by the invisible hand of the filmmaker or the director. This is an opportunity to see the process, and to see how art can be used to create more understanding and bring catharsis and healing, hopefully to some degree as well.
Well, that's what I found so fascinating about your documentary, the beautiful widescreen animation, which looks great, and the live action, the interviews, and as you say, the surviving member of that group. Bringing all of that together into a coherent documentary, I think you've done a brilliant job on that, and that must have been quite a painstaking approach for you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. Yes, it's, I mentioned there was this inspiration that I felt we had the opportunity to do something unique, but as someone who works in both animation and documentary, I feel, there's opportunities to marry the two, but if you're going and the processes between the two of them are very different. So typically with documentary, you go out, you shoot 100 hours of footage, you sit in the editing suite and you just chip away at it and the story eventually emerges. You can't do that in animation because animation is very time consuming and expensive. So typically you'll have a script that you lock and then you're going to make storyboards based on that. You'll build an animatic or a Leica reel, a kind of film based on the storyboards. And you have every shot determined very concretely before you go and invest the time and energy into the animation. And as you can see from this film, we weren't doing that because you see elements of the creation process. You see portions of the animation, you see him sharing it with people, you see him drawing these things. It's very meta in the sense that these things are happening and you see the making of the whole product. So it was unique and it was a unique opportunity, but it was also quite a leap of faith in the sense of like, we're making scenes that we're not exactly sure how we're going to get to this scene or how we're going to come out of it, but we're going to animate it because we know it's, and so you just you have a sense that it's going to work. You have a talented, not a large team, but a talented team of people who really share this vision and this passion and are fortunately willing to go on this journey with you. And then in the end, you come out with something quite unique, but a lot of heart and sweat and, and energy invested in the process.
Absolutely, and that comes across so strongly in Eternal Spring, such an incredible film. I'm quite intrigued. You talk about the Falun Gong and give us some background about who they are, etc. It seems quite incredible that they are still being ostracized by the Chinese Communist Party, amongst other groups like the Uyghur as well. The human rights situation in China must be quite amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's really unfortunate. And I think that this is something that, this is something that I've noticed with just spending my time with these people who are coming out of China. And the thing is, from the outside perspective, we often pay attention to something when it's new. If we look at the conflict going on in Russia, an enormous amount of coverage, in the Ukraine involving Russia, an enormous amount of coverage at the outset, still a large volume of it, but a lot of people start to, as time goes by, there's a bit of compassion fatigue. People tend to focus on something else. And so there will be a lot of issues in the world, and Falun Gong was one of them, where, when the persecution first began and this crackdown was launched in the late 90s, it was a big item on the news. And then as time moves on and we kind of, we don't hear about it so much anymore. Part of that is just that, things have moved on. The Chinese government may not be publicly talking about it and trying to publicly denounce Falun Gong so, expressly anymore. But that doesn't mean that the situation for the adherents there has improved. And so one of the goals we had with this film was to reintroduce that yes, Falun Gong is a massive human rights concern in China still today. Some of these people, even though the event and this hijacking event are facing a 20th anniversary this year, the people who are coming out are coming out recently, and they've still been in prisons, and they've done another round of arrests in the lead up to the recent Winter Olympic Games as well. So these people continue to suffer today. And then I think the other thing though too is that the story isn't just about Falun Gong in the sense that you see the treatment, like you mentioned with the Uyghurs. A lot of the treatment that we saw with the Falun Gong community in terms of this large scale arrest and imprisonment in labor camps and these kinds of things, we see that now with the massive internments of the Uyghur population in the Northwest and this kind of coercive effort to have people abandon their religion and their culture and their beliefs and values. So you see the same tactics now being employed against other groups. We also see the quick erosion of freedoms in Hong Kong and the inability to speak out against any government narrative there. So there are sort of echoes of what we've seen in the persecution of Falun Gong with other groups. And I think that's another important reason to remind people of this, is to say, sometimes we have this feeling like, okay, well, that's one group, that's an isolated issue, that's affecting one community, and it might seem remote or far away from us. But the reality is that when these things continue, they will affect others, and they don't go away on their own. So I think that hopefully this film can help to shine a light on, I think, a remarkable story of courage, but also an ongoing human rights issue there, and to give us a lens to see other things that are taking place now in China as well.
Absolutely, and I think your film will do that. It's quite incredible about the way these people were treated, and the actual trying to infiltrate the television station is such an interesting idea, which of course didn't work. But so filming aspects of that, which of course a lot of film wasn't available, so the animation was so important in terms of fleshing out the story, but still being able to show some live action and some interviews and the surviving member of that event and so on. That must have been quite a process for you in putting all of that together in a coherent sort of form.
Yes, exactly. It took some feeling out. There was a sense that we wanted to have both. I mean, there were questions very, very early on about whether we would stick entirely with animation. Animation, especially from this artist, you know, it's personal. It has the opportunity to sort of transport you to a place that you cannot get with a camera right now. I mean, many of these people, without spoiling too much, are simply unable to speak in front of a camera because they're no longer with us, or they are imprisoned or unreachable. And so animation provided a very unique opportunity. But I think for a couple of reasons, it was important to find a way to blend the live action in. One was to situate it and to say, okay, here is this individual who's drawing this, so that we're aware that we're seeing things through his lens, and that we can see the sort of personal qualities that he's attached to these things. And there's another dimension or another layer to the experience. And I think the other part was to sort of substantiate the fact that these are real people and these are real things. So we see the people like Mr. White, we see him through the process of recounting all of these things. He's facing what he's experienced. We see the other witnesses who we collected together in New York there, who are reliving these things and seeing the people that they remembered, right? And so it hits home that way. I think it's important. Also, there was a conscious decision, you know, because so many films, when they're about China or about human rights, there's a temptation to bring in the external third party who can help to contextualize it for us. And I feel that, you know, we were able to achieve some of that with the news archival footage, to remind people that these were stories in the news, that these are real issues, that they were reported on. But we made a conscious decision with a group that I think is poorly understood in Falun Gong, to really have an opportunity for them to speak for themselves and to put the viewer in their community, to see how they felt, to see why they did what they did, and to even see the different opinions around issues like this. Because you can see that people didn't all agree with the idea of hijacking the television. And even Dashong, our sort of main character that we're seeing the story through, had mixed feelings at the outset of this because of the massive human costs that followed, and whether it was really aligned with Falun Gong's, you know, tenets, so to speak. So I feel that, you know, that was an important thing, is to let people see how the community felt, how the different people, and I think through that process, everyone can get a better sense of Falun Gong and the community through that. But then also sort of finding those opportunities to bring us back into live action, and then to substantiate with the archival material. And I think the unique thing for us was the fact that we had an artist who was drawing while he was in the interviews. So his pen to paper is an opportunity to come in and out of the artwork, right? And to just remind us that those two are connected in some way.
Definitely, that does come across so strongly and so interestingly. So the product of that is the editing process, where you've shot so much material, and I can imagine that it
Is that the product of that?
Sorry, we're back. Okay. Yes, I was just talking about the editing process and how you make decisions about how you finally structured the documentary.
Yeah, so I had a great editor, Dave Schmidt. It's you would think on a unique, challenging project like this, I would go to someone who's edited many films before, and I was tempted to do that. But Dave, he's worked as an assistant editor on a lot of films with great, talented filmmakers here in Canada, but he had never been the lead editor on a feature film. But I just started working with him because I was cutting together sort of teasers when I was doing a workshop at the Sundance Collab, the online thing that they had there, just to work the story with other filmmakers. And he collaborated with me on that. And then we just kept editing. And I just found, wow, there's such a unique, you really look for a relationship, because making a film is a lot like, sometimes I liken it to raising a child. It's a bit of a marriage type relationship. You know, you need a push and pull, and you need someone who can complement your ideas, who understands what you're thinking, but is not just going to, you know, echo what you're already thinking, and comes with different ideas, so that there's this tension, because you need to find something that's not there yet. And so we just had a great working relationship, and it just sort of took off from there and went through that entire process. But I think, you know, one of the ways to work in terms of the structures, we had a general sense that we wanted to have this mix of live action and animation, but it was a bit of feeling it out. And so one way to start with that is to say, okay, Dashong, the artist character, what's in your mind? What are your experiences? And so we started with a few scenes that were very much from him. And in the meantime, we're doing these interviews and he's participating in them. And so behind the scenes, I'm cutting some of that together with Dave as a traditional documentary, but the animation is proceeding with a number of these scenes that were very personal to Dashong. So that's sort of the memories of his hometown. And it's because we wanted it to be honest. So what is it that you remember? What is it that you miss? And that's where we have these very vivid memories, sort of dreamlike of his childhood, where he likens the city of Changchun to a fairy tale for children. And that's how he experienced it. And that's how he remembered it. And another scene that was early on, and now these are not all in order in the film, of course, they're placed in different places in the final product, but that scene where he's running from his own paintbrushes, you could see that he was carrying this heaviness of the trauma that he had gone through and the difficulty when he's starting to reface some of these issues again through this film production process. And we just let him get that out. And those are his actual own, calligraphy brush strokes that we have animated in a 3D space that he's running from. And so that was very personal. And I think the other layer was really the night of the hijacking and what this meant, not just to the individuals who were involved, but this sort of cross section of people across the city of Changchun. You know, we had the sort of, the railway station manager and his daughter, and there's people that he just brought us into different living rooms. And so then from there, and from all the interviews and what we were hearing about how this affected the city, we cut together these little side stories, these B stories that we would then lay out throughout the entire film. But we started from the artist and from what was in his mind. And then in the meantime, we were doing these interviews and trying to cut together sort of a traditional doc structure that made sense at the same time. So doing kind of two productions at the same time that fortunately in the end somewhere met in the middle and all coalesced.
It definitely all coalesced really brilliantly, and that's what was so impressive. So Eternal Spring is screening as part of the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival, which is terrific. Has the film been screened elsewhere, or will it be screened elsewhere?
So that will be the Australian premiere, but we've been on the tour now in North America and Europe. So our world premiere was at Thessaloniki at the documentary festival there, where we were fortunate to win the Peter Wintonic Audience Prize for the Best Feature Film, as well as a jury prize from the Greek Parliament. We played at The Hague with Movies That Matter, where we also had a special jury mention there as well. We've now picked up 10 festival awards. We won both audience prizes at Hot Docs here in Toronto, which is the top doc fest in North America. And we've just been on a run. We had another half dozen prizes in 2 weeks in the US, where we've been on a run. So it's been outstanding. This is the type of thing, it's a unique project. You work on it for a long time. You put a lot of heart into it. You don't know how the audience is going to react. You want them to react the same way that you did with the material. Your job as a filmmaker is to say, can I create an experience in 90 minutes that affects someone the same way that I was able to be affected when I devoted all of my energy and time to this subject and to all these people, right? And so you don't know for sure. You test, you try things out, but the real test is when you put it in front of an audience. And we feel very fortunate that people have been connecting the way that we would hope and wish. And it's not just the that really means a lot, not just as a filmmaker, because you want to create films that people enjoy, but when you're entrusted with a story where people were essentially sacrificing their freedom, their well-being, potentially even their lives in some cases, in order to speak out, and then you spend so much time with their story, it's inevitable that you sort of feel a certain duty to carry on and be able to share their message. You sense that they can't say those things themselves, so you want to be that provide them that voice. And so when people connect with it, it means a lot from that perspective as well.
Definitely does. The power of documentary, the power of film to relay a message, and your film certainly demonstrates that. I don't suppose the film will be screened in China.
If I get an invitation from China, it's probably a one-way ticket. Actually, during the making of this film, I mentioned that I started working with Dashong on a Kung Fu video game. I was making 2 human rights films on China at the same time. This one stretched over 5 years, and I did another film, which ended up being my first, in the middle of this production. That was called Ask No Questions a couple of years ago. But in the midst of making these 2 films, the Chinese government contacted my business partners at Tencent. Tencent was going to be the publisher of the game, a huge media company in China. They're very big in the gaming space. The government contacted them and forced them to cut ties with my company just in the midst of our launch. And then my wife's family members who are still in Changchun started receiving calls from the Public Security Bureau in China, warning them that they knew what we were up to overseas. So when people say that, there are potential financial repercussions or let's not upset China, I get it. Those things are real. But at the same time, it's like we all make that kind of calculation that we're going to avoid these sensitive subjects. And that's why 20 years on, such a remarkable story is unknown to most people. And I just felt meeting these people who were coming out of China, who had sacrificed so much to be able to tell their story, that, even if there were some complications on my end or that we were facing some pressure and whatnot, it was still important to give a voice to these people because they had sacrificed much, much more with their story in order to be able to share it. And, fortunately, we went ahead, we finished the film, and then we're really encouraged by the audiences because it seems like so many people are connecting with it in the same way. They value the film, they value the message there. And so that means it's all worthwhile from my perspective.
Absolutely. The messages are so strong, and it's also the filmmaking style, the combination of animation and live action, and as you described, the way you've interpolated other bits and pieces into the film to really get the message across, and that's what makes it such a compelling film. So congratulations on all those awards that you've received and so on. That's great for you as a filmmaker.
Thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful, both as a filmmaker and for the prospects of this film as well, which we hope to be widely seen. It helps an enormous amount.
Okay. Well, I'm just intrigued. As you say, you've made a few other films, but are there any inspirations in terms of films or filmmakers who may have impacted on you?
I think it's kind of film by film. I think one of my character traits is that I have probably an attention deficit issue, which I try to use as my advantage. So, we make this, I've done a couple of documentaries as a director. I've worked with other very capable directors as a producer in the past. And also I work with narrative games. We do narrative video games. We do virtual reality. We do short form animation. We've done preschool series. So every time I work in another medium, I feel like I carry with me something from it. And sometimes it's not even conscious, but I think it makes me a better storyteller and a better communicator across mediums. So, as an example, a number of people who watch this film, and it's happened a couple of times where they would approach me and say, "Oh, you really had an interesting video game aesthetic in this." And I had to scratch my head and say, "Really?" Because I never had any conscious effort of making anything video game-like about this. But then I would watch it with that thought in the back of my head. And I started to notice, okay, well, you know what? We were dealing with a lot of Chinese characters. And obviously we tried to limit the number of characters in the film so that people, who are not from China and not familiar with these people and not familiar with the story would be able to follow it. But another thing that we did was we had these little sort of character icons that popped up, with an illustrated version of the person's face from the animation, and they're kind of little, the lower third, but we did it in this kind of stylized thing that honestly, it looks familiar if you've played a lot of visual novels and these types of narrative games. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense. Now, it was totally subconscious, but that's probably what people were talking about when people mention this kind of aesthetic. So I feel like when you work across different mediums, you bring something. The last film I co-directed together with Eric Petticelli, it was an investigative documentary, had a very different feel to it, very different vibe. And I'm okay with working. It's not that I need to have a particular style with each project, but it's like when you immerse yourself in a story, you ask yourself, what's the best way to communicate this story? And then you kind of take on all of the style, the motifs, the vibe, everything that you want to have there that I think might be unique in each case. So yeah, that's sort of an indirect answer to your question, but I think it's kind of like a bit of everything when you come to a project and just saying, what's the best way to communicate this story?
Absolutely, I understand that eclectic sort of notion, which you described so well. So that's perfectly fine. Just to conclude very briefly, are you working on another film at the moment?
So right now I'm working on an animated sci-fi series, a narrative video game, and a VR short film that's in the Eternal Spring world. So the one project that I'm working on that is still connected to Eternal Spring is, and this is kind of relates to the last thing we just talked about, is that I feel different stories and experiences really lend themselves to different mediums. And in virtual reality, I don't think it has the same potential for a full linear storytelling experience like a feature film. I don't think there's any replacement for feature film in that regard. But just because you can't control the shot in the same way. So, when you're as a director in a feature film, if you want a close-up shot, you can use that to communicate emotion. In VR, if you have a close-up shot, there's someone just right in your face and it's very uncomfortable, the feeling. So it doesn't have the same conventions. And also you are essentially the main character because everything is happening from a first-person perspective in VR because you're fully immersed in an environment. So it removes that ability to sort of empathize with an external character. But what it is very powerful for is putting yourself into someone else's shoes. And so what we've done with the VR film, which is a short that we're just finishing now, and we'll start to submit that to festivals as well, is a personal experience of Mr. White, one of the hijackers, a surviving hijacker. There's elements of his personal story that we don't get into in the film. And I felt it really lent itself to a VR experience where you could just experience what it was like, in his life when he first encountered Falun Gong, what that experience meant to him, what it meant when the state started, repressing Falun Gong, and every channel you turned on, the state misinformation campaign was there. And then what is it like when you're always afraid of being arrested, when you're trying to get the word out? And then what is it like when you are arrested? What is that experience like of being essentially abducted, and then interrogated and experiencing all of these different things and being separated from your wife, which is something we don't get into in the film. So we do that through the first person perspective that I think VR lends itself to very well.
Very, very interesting to hear that. And just finally, the Canadian film industry, I've spoken to other Canadian filmmakers and they're varying comments about support that you receive, financial, etc. How does the Canadian film industry at the moment work for you?
Well, I feel very appreciative of the support that we have here. There are a variety of them. It doesn't mean that it's easy. There are a lot of, you have to work very hard still as a filmmaker here to find those opportunities. But Canada does care about, I think, sharing diverse stories and unique stories on the international stage. We have some support from Telefilm, which has helped us to participate in some of these festivals, and we'll have some support from the embassy to be there in Australia for the Q&As, which is so important. And it sounds like we're going to have a great crowd there as well, which is very exciting. Here, still it's difficult to get a very, very unique project like this off the ground in one go. And so I benefited, I think, from the fact that we work in different mediums. And so I was able to do, like a digital comic book, an Apple Pencil app where you can kind of draw participate as a background artist, and the VR film that I mentioned. These elements helped us to sort of create an overall, critical mass of projects that helped us to create the assets we would need for the film as well. So you have to be creative, but there is support there. And, and you just have to look for those opportunities where what you're trying to do aligns with what opportunities are out there, just like in any other jurisdiction. But I think Canada has a particular focus on supporting Canadian stories and Canadian storytellers. So we're very thankful for that.
That is very good to hear. Go and see Eternal Spring. It is part of the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival, certainly one of the highlights. And we've been speaking to the director, Jason Loftus. Jason, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Peter. Take care.
Bye-bye.